Arvoyarns.
So before we were talking about entrepreneurship, I feel like there's this paradox, and it might not always be the case. Like, we can get to a point of civilization level self-sustaining and knowledgeability around it that, like you said, from the get-go, it's like you need to be this conscientious of product lifestyle, product development, scaling a business, and so on, but in a way that is not so difficult for people because of the infrastructure is built up enough to support the new business owners, or however it works in the future, that actually a lot of people could do it if they so choose. Now, you probably have to work really hard, but you could do it. That's not the paradigm right now. Right now, I think about, okay, so like I want to start a business myself, and I think to myself, okay, well, you've got to get to this critical mass point to be able to make it keep going at all, right? And in that period especially, I think a lot of people are more willing to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. And here's one of the great ways to sum it up, which is in startups, in the period of the scaling of the startup, you have to do things that won't scale. Do things that won't scale, but they will help you on the way to a self-sustaining scaling model.
Like, what's an example?
Like, an example would be like if you reached out to a bunch of people to do something, but the type of people you reached out to and the way that you, and what you wanted them to do and stuff like that, it wasn't like you were going to be able to get a vast amount of people to do it, and it was basically like a one-shot trick, and once you did it, it was done. Okay. Now, it was useful because it helped you to leverage this other thing in your business so that you could be more successful, but it's not something
so
that
you're
you
saying
can...
something like I want to start a solar panel company, but like I'll take this grant from ExxonMobil, to kickstart, and then be like, well, I'll,
It could be anything, really, but I think that for me, I think, okay, how could I start a business? And then ultimately I have these aspirations of when I have a significant amount of liquidity in my life that I could really do special things, like help certain types of environments a lot, buy the land up, restore it, things like that, give it back, empower the communities, build schools and things like that. That all requires like a lot of liquidity, right? And I feel like there's the very realistic juxtaposition of the entrepreneur right now where you fuck the earth to get that money, and then you're like, now I'm gonna be the good guy, and now I'm gonna help the communities, and now I'm gonna help restore the forests and everything. But in the meantime, you had to cause this gigantic...
It's very like, it's like you sin, and then, you ask for
You're like, oh,
forgiveness,
now I'm comfortable enough that I can ask for forgiveness, and I'm willing to help.
Well, I mean, I also don't think it's necessarily like that black and white.
Oh, of course not.
It's just not. Like we were talking about this a little bit before we started filming, but it's really difficult. It really is very difficult to do things that are, forget about perfect, but like it's just really difficult to do things that are like overall positive for the environment. I mean, just as an example, if I manage the business I've worked for 18 years, we deal a lot in textile scraps, right? But, we have, like, if we're going to take these textile scraps and make them into a new product, there's still packaging involved with that product. It requires a lot of energy consumption to create that product. You could list stuff like that for almost any business that I can think of. Recycling in and of itself, uses a lot of energy, not just for the collection side of it, but to actually go through the process. These are all imperfect processes, just like we live in an imperfect world. But I think what you're speaking of is sort of like a more extreme example. Someone who makes billions and millions of dollars and then starts a foundation to give back afterward. To
all the people they screwed or something. That kind of thing happens.
Yeah. So. But all of this is really difficult. Even if you have like the best intentions and you keep in mind what's the best, the most environmentally friendly decision.
Yeah.
Like even if you think about that every single decision you make, you're not, it's not going to be perfect.
It actually is more hamstringing in a way. I'm glad you bring that up, because when I lived in New Zealand, I worked for a sustainability services startup, and I remember that we held this keynote conference at one point, and we had a woman who was a climate scientist there from New Zealand, and she had actually given a TED Talk previously, very esteemed in the community. She was actually a consultant for Bhutan, and for those that don't know, Bhutan is a small country next to India and China, where they've decided that it's all about being net positive for the environment and the citizens. So actually, instead of GDP as their highest valuation of like a distinguishing factor of how their their society is doing in a successful way, it's actually gross domestic happiness. And so they have this happiness index for how fulfilled are the people of the society. And so too, along with this, they're committed to being carbon negative on a country level. That's their goal. Now, she's a consultant for them. And it's really interesting. Bhutan is so stringent that it's almost impossible to get in the country if you're an outsider. They only allow, I've heard they only allow 150 tourist visas per year, which end up being, you have to be a kind of like a distinguished person among that 150 to even get it. Like, oh yeah, it would be relevant for so-and-so to become, because maybe they would spread the word in a way that's positive or something like that.
What's the country's population?
It's not a lot of people. I think it's definitely less than 10 million.
Okay.
And it's probably the size of maybe it's like 2/3 2/3 the size of Utah, I'd say. So not a lot of,
geographically.
yeah,
okay.
yeah. So not a lot of people for the size of the land, relatively speaking. But I remember asking her about this because I thought it was so fucking cool. I said, "So how's it going?" And she said, "Honestly, I don't think it's gonna work." I said, "Why?" And she said, it's just too much. It's just too much to ask at this point in time for where Bhutan is as a country in terms of infrastructure at this point in time. She says it's this crazy juxtaposition. It's like, well, it would be easier if you were more developed, but if you were more developed, you would have had to do things that were sort of crimes against the environment and humanity, so to speak, to then get yourself in the position. And so it's kind of like, it's a goal for them that she said in the short to medium term is maybe impossible to achieve.
I mean, it's weird because it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe there's a sort of stereotyped like path to like development that people take or whatever, but it actually seems like it'd be easier if you were starting, a little bit, more from scratch to be able to like build more sustainable systems to begin with. I mean, because like a lot of this stuff, you think about like the United States, like for example, we're like so locked into cars, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, obviously cars, historically,
people know the value of
culture,
cars, yeah.
But it's, for example, in the 1950s, there was a huge push due to, the Cold War fears of nuclear war that, like, because, the cities are going to be like sitting ducks, like, just, blow up these, New York City, Washington, D.C., the government encouraged, the growth of suburbs and the building of the highway system as we understand today, as opposed to, what had been the dominant trend before that, which was trains. I mean, to the extent that, like, it was so far as I understand, government policy to, cripple in some way, say, like the New York subway, precisely in order to make the city, like, less accessible, in a way, in hopes of like decentralizing the country to make it less vulnerable. And that was a choice, and maybe it made sense, or like in some geopolitical way, at the time.
Yeah, sure.
But then there's like this sort of nightmare situation where those same mistakes are just repeated over and over and over again, because that becomes the idea, like this is what it means to be like a developed country or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember talking to an architect on a plane once, and I said, I hear about, I'll read articles and watch videos about this latest new thing in architecture all the time. And I said, but I never see any of it. And he said, yeah, I mean, no kidding, right? I mean, it makes sense, though, that you wouldn't see it, Pete, because think about it. The building,
who can afford these?
Your building's already built. Just
Well,
because the new building model comes out and it's way better, you're not going to knock down your building and build a whole new one. That doesn't make any sense unless it's really time for you to build that.
Well, there's
and
a
the
huge
new model,
problem in
like, really
architecture
aligns with
generally,
it.
where it's just like the only people who can afford the most like experimental and like avant-garde buildings are just
Yeah,
millionaires. And
he had said So I said, how far are we behind from the cutting edge of what we can do? Where are we on a societal level in terms of how we generally operate with our infrastructure? He said 40 years. And that's just, and it's like that in certain industries, if you even want to think of architecture as an industry. But it's like that with certain things. It just takes time because buildings are there. I mean, once you build the building, you can't do the latest, greatest thing the next year.
Arvoyarns.